Dale Brennan had always believed water had its own kind of voice. It whispered in springtime. When snowmelt slipped down from the Rockies in restless silver threads, it chuckled in summer, tumbling over smooth stones in the shallow bends. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the banks were heavy with cottonwood fluff, the creek spoke in a slow, contented murmur. Not to the town, not even to the whole valley. But to him alone, Cottonwood Creek had been part of the Brennan family for nearly a century and a half, long ago. In 1873, his great-grandfather, a wiry, dust-covered man with eyes the same shade as mountain ice, had claimed its water rights when he built the first cabin on the property. Back in those days, water was worth more than gold in Colorado. And even though time had changed almost everything else, those rights had never slipped from Brennan hands. It's not once. Now Dale was the last Brennan standing on that stretch of land. He was 65, skin-leathered from decades of fieldwork with the kind of calm that came from measuring rivers, studying wetlands, and fixing pipes in places where the nearest neighbor might be a bighorn sheep. A retired hydrologist, which is just a fancy way of saying he'd spent his life learning how water moves, behaves, and sometimes rebels. He'd worked with government agencies, tribes, conservation groups. When he looked at a stream, he could see not just its surface, but its story, where it had come from, what it carried, and where it was going. Cottonwood Creek was special, even by his standards. Its water ran so clean you could drink it straight from your hands, which Dale did, often. The trout here were fat and quick. Blue herons nested upstream. Wild mint, willows, and tall green sedges crowded the banks, holding the soil steady even in spring floods. It was a living thing, balanced, healthy, and deeply connected to the land's history. This wasn't just a creek. It was his inheritance, his responsibility, and, if he was honest, his anchor. But the peace didn't last. The trouble drifted in quietly at first, like the faint smell of smoke from a fire you can't see. It came in the form of smiling neighbors, with strange ideas, official letters in tidy envelopes, and the sudden appearance of a woman named Brenda Hartwell. Brenda wasn't from here. She was a real estate agent out of Denver, loud, sharp, always dressed like she was headed to sell $1 million downtown loft. She had recently become president of the new Homeowners Association in Cottonwood Estates, development that had been creeping closer to Dale's land in the last decade, in theory. The HOA was supposed to handle things like shared snow removal and road repairs. That's what the residents had been told when they'd signed the dotted line. But Brenda had grander visions. She wanted a certain look, neat lawns, matching mailboxes, modern infrastructure. And apparently, that modern infrastructure included changing the creek to Dale. That idea made about as much sense as repainting the sky. But Brenda's plan, as she put it, was already in motion. She called it a flood control project. Dale called it trouble. He tried to reason with her the first time they met, explained how the creek naturally handled spring floods, pointed to the deep natural channels, the healthy root systems, the way the floodplain soaked up excess water. He even mentioned his credentials, not as bragging, but so she'd know this wasn't just a sentimental old man talking. Brenda smiled politely, the way someone does when they've already decided exactly how they're going to ignore you. A couple of months later, Dale woke one morning to the low growl of diesel engines. He stepped outside and saw men in hard hats unloading sections of precast concrete. The air reeked of wet cement. They weren't here to protect the creek. They were here to put it in a cage. The thing about water, it remembers its freedom. Trap it in a straight, hard channel, strip away the plants, smooth the stones, and it will bite back. Before this was over, Dale would prove it. Science, with history, and with every scrap of strength he had left. But for now, he stood in the still, cool morning air, listening not to the creek's bubbling voice, but to the harsh, metallic clatter of men building a mistake. Something deep inside him, a quiet, stubborn, Brennan thing clicked into place. This was war. The first official strike came in an envelope. It was smooth, cream-colored, with the HOA logo in gold on the corner. Inside, a letter full of polite but sharp words. Violation notice number 001, unauthorized natural. Vegetation. Dale read it twice. Somewhere between the "we appreciate your cooperation" and the "failure to comply" will result in fines. He started laughing out loud, alone in his kitchen. Unauthorized natural vegetation. They were talking about his willows, sedges, cottonwoods, plants that had kept the creek's banks from eroding since Ulysses S. Grant was president. But the clock was ticking according to the letter. He had 14 days to bring the area into compliance by removing these plants and replacing them with approved low-maintenance landscaping, meaning decorative gravel and drought-resistant shrubs that looked like they belonged in a strip mall parking lot. Dale didn't so much as lift a shovel. Instead, he walked down to the creek and sat on the big flat rock his grandfather had always used as a seat. The letter fluttered in his hand like a white flag he'd never wave. Brenda, however, turned up the heat. The next week, one of her allies on the HOA board happened to stop by Dale's property. Tall man, mirrored sunglasses, too wide. Smile. He tried charm first, hinting that if Dale just let the HOA do their upgrades, his property value could go through the roof. Dale's answer was simple. "My roof's just fine where it is." After that, the petty harassment began. It started with small things. A set of fresh tire ruts across his driveway gravel. Asterisk. Anonymous complaint calls to the county about water waste, which the county inspector begrudgingly dismissed as nonsense. Overnight, a for sale sign planted on the edge of his property, which Dale yanked out and used to prop up his tomato plants. Then it got nastier. One morning, walking to the creek, Dale found the water murky. Its usual mountain glass clarity turned brown with disturbed sediment. Cateo tracks and a pile of crushed beer cans told the story. Someone had driven through a shallow section, tearing up the bottom and dumping garbage for good measure. Dale wasn't quick to anger, but this was different. When you attack a man's home, that's one thing. When you attack the living heart of it, the creek, you aren't just picking a fight, you're telling him you think you can win. He lodged a formal complaint with the county's environmental department and added a thick packet of photographs. He included historical data about the creek's health and, knowing full well how bureaucracy works, cited the sections of the Colorado Water Quality Control Act that applied. Still, Brenda strutted around the next HOA meeting as if nothing was amiss. Dale attended, sitting in the back, listening more than speaking. He watched her feed words into the room like bait. Modernization, safety, community image. She painted Cottonwood Creek as a disaster waiting to happen, a flood risk that would destroy property values. The part that nearly made Dale choke was when she claimed she had engineering reports to prove it. He recognized the trick. Immediately, she had taken half-truths, padded them with bad data, tucked them into official-sounding phrases to intimidate anyone without. They know how to challenge her. This was the first moment Dale realized the fight wasn't just about concrete and water. It was about narrative. Whoever told the better story would control the outcome in HOA meetings, in public opinion, and eventually in court. His grandfather's words echoed in his head. Water always finds a way around the rock. People do too. Over the next weeks, Dale began gathering his ammo, not bullets, but records. He dug out his grandfather's meticulous 1973 engineering survey of Cottonwood Creek, which warned exactly what would happen if anyone tried to force it into a narrow, straight channel. He made copies of newer hydrology models and rainfall data. He reached out quietly to a few old colleagues still working in water resource agencies, just to let them know what was happening. The creek was still running, but the air in Cottonwood, the States, was thickening. It's like the heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Brenda's bulldozers hadn't reached Dale's property yet, but the rumble was getting closer. And Dale, for all his quiet patience, was already planning his counterattack. The first time Dale saw the excavator bucket dip into Cottonwood Creek, it felt like watching someone try to cut the throat of a living thing. There was nothing subtle about it anymore. No meetings, no warning letters, just steel teeth biting into soft banks, scooping up decades of packed earth and root systems in greedy swipes. The smell came first, sharp, mineral, unnatural, cement dust mixing with the scent of crushed sedge and freshly broken willow limbs. Then came the sound, a deep mechanical growl that drowned out the gentle chatter of water over stones. For the first time in his life, Dale couldn't hear the creek's voice. Dale moved fast. He didn't yell at the crew. That'd be wasted breath. They were just doing a job for the man holding the checkbook. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started filming everything. The digging, the cement blocks stacked like dominoes, the chunks of dislodged root clumps floating away. "What are you doing?" Brenda's voice came sharp from behind him. She'd parked her shiny white SUV at the edge of the work zone, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She looked exactly like she did when she showed houses, except here she was selling a vision of progress that Dale wanted nothing to do with. "Documenting an environmental violation," he said. "Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, U.S. Code. Heard of it?" The slight twitch in Brenda's jaw was all the answer he needed. In less than 48 hours, Dale had filed complaints with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Colorado Division of Water Resources. He attached not just the video footage, but his grandfather's 1973 report, the one that spelled out exactly why a concrete channel would not only damage the ecosystem, but increase flood risks downstream. He knew it wasn't an instant stop work button. Government agencies move at the speed of glaciers, and Brenda's crew had probably gotten the permits they needed by sliding through the cracks of local jurisdiction. But Dale also knew something else. Every bucket of dirt they moved, every slab of concrete they laid without the required federal clearance, would become another nail in Brenda's legal coffin. He wasn't the only one watching. A few neighbors, the kind who usually kept their heads down when HOA politics boiled over, had started to wander toward the noise. A retired schoolteacher named Marla snapped photos from her porch. A young couple walking their dogs stopped to film the work zone from the shoulder. By the end of the week, someone had posted side-by-side images on social media before. Wide, clear water, bank lush with cottonwoods, after a sterile gray channel. Water squeezed into an unnatural straight line. The photo set was titled, "What Progress Looks Like," apparently. It took on a life of its own. Brenda struck back quickly. Within days, Dale received a thick envelope from the HOA's attorney, accusing him of defamation for publicly criticizing the Creek project. Buried in the legalese was a threat of escalating fines and even foreclosure proceedings if he interfered. Further, Dale smiled at the envelope for a long moment before tucking it into a folder marked evidence. Two can play this game. Then, the first tangible consequence of the concrete channeling hit. A light late summer rain rolled across the valley. Nothing more than a friendly sprinkle to farmers and gardeners. But to the creek, already stripped of its natural floodplain buffering, it was like being forced into a too small pipe. The water surged faster through the channel, bouncing and slamming against the concrete walls, carrying sediment and debris. Further downstream where the streamlining ended, within hours, a section of bank downstream outside the HOA boundary collapsed entirely. A neighbor's fence and part of their goat pen went with it. The neighbor, Marla's cousin, and Marla had plenty to say at the next HOA meeting. Dale didn't have to raise his voice. The damage spoke louder than he ever could. He simply stood, photos in hand, and laid out exactly what was happening. The concrete channel increased. Water velocity, the accelerated flow amplified erosion downstream. This was precisely what the 1973 Brennan report had predicted, and then he made his move. He announced that he was seeking a federal injunction to stop the project. Brenda laughed, a little too loudly. But Dale noticed she didn't meet his eyes when she sat down. The war was now out in the open. No more polite, neighborly facades. No more letters pretending to be administrative. The HOA's heavy machinery had invaded. Dale's land and Dale's knowledge, history, and legal backing were about to invade theirs. Some people fight with fists, some with money. Dale Brennan fought with water, law, and truth, and he had all three on his side. Some people break, Rules because they don't know better, Brenda. Hartwell wasn't one of them. Dale had suspected for weeks that the creek flood control story was just the pretty bow on an ugly package. And if there's one thing hydrologists learn early, it's that the truth, like water, tends to seep out in the places people didn't mean to leave open. So Dale started turning over stones. He dug in the HOA's publicly available meeting minutes, financial reports, and county building documents. Most of it was boring on purpose, endless pages about landscaping bids and snowplow schedules. But here and there, he found threads that didn't match. An emergency creek engineering assessment that cost $48,000. But no record of who provided it and no copy of the report itself. A landscaping contract paid at triple the standard rate, awarded to a company owned by Brenda's brother-in-law. A community improvement fund with large withdrawals labeled only. As miscellaneous as to an average neighbor, these might have looked like sloppy bookkeeping. To Dale, they were red flags snapping in the wind. He called in a favor from a former colleague, one of the best forensic accountants he knew. A meticulous woman named Sheila who wore reading glasses like a weapon. Dale sent her everything he had, and within a week, she sent back a spreadsheet that read less like a budget and more like a crime novel. The short version, nearly $200,000 of HOA funds had been drained into shady, untraceable expenses over the last 2 years. Some of it lined up with the creek project, most of it didn't. "Oh, she's dirty," Sheila said flatly over the phone. "If she thinks she's clever, she's not half as clever as she thinks." Meanwhile, Brenda was still holding weekly community progress coffee mornings, complete with pastry trays and a giant artist rendering of the modernized creek hung on an easel. She used words like safe, clean, and property value boost as though the real Cottonwood Creek didn't exist just a few hundred yards away, groaning under its new concrete prison. Dale attended exactly one of these events, quietly. Sipping his coffee while Brenda tried not to notice him, he didn't speak. He didn't have to, because 2 days later, copies of Sheila's findings neatly collated, with numbered exhibits landed on the desks of the HOA's treasurer, the county district attorney, the state attorney general's office, and, for good measure, the local newspaper's investigative desk. The first domino fell faster than Dale expected. The newspaper ran a Sunday front page feature under the headline, "HOA President Under Fire Over Missing Funds." The story was brutal, not only exposing questionable contracts, but also questioning the sudden urgency of the Creek Channel project. The journalist even quoted Dale's 1973 family report, side by side with a current environmental engineer's opinion, both stating the project increased flood risk. On Monday morning, the HOA board meeting was standing room only. "Fabrications," Brenda hissed across the room, her voice tight, but still coated in her salesperson charm. "These are outright fabrications designed to smear the hardworking people who care about this community." Her hands shook slightly when she shuffled her notes. Dale caught that. So did everyone else. When the treasurer, red-faced and clearly terrified of going down with the ship, Kay admitted that the emergency creek engineering assessment file was misplaced, the noise in the room went from murmurs to open outrage. Neighbors Dale barely knew stood up, demanding answers. A young mother, holding her toddler in one hip, asked why homeowner dues had jumped 25% last year. If there was no transparency in spending, it was the first crack in Brenda's armor that everyone could see. Still, Brenda wasn't out. She played. A fence claiming Dale's opposition was personal, that his ownership of historic water rights was a selfish attempt to control shared resources. She tried to paint him as the town's eccentric hermit, a man rooted in the past, unwilling to embrace change. What she didn't realize was that the more she belittled him, the more she pushed undecided neighbors toward his side. People could smell insecurity. Brenda's perfume wasn't masking it. Dale knew momentum mattered, so alongside the financial evidence, he began organizing what he called creek walks, guided tours of Cottonwood Creek for anyone curious. To see what progress had done, he explained exactly how healthy creeks handled floods, how the plants along the banks worked as natural water filters, how concrete stripped away habitat for trout and frogs. He didn't shout. He didn't rant. He just told the truth, in plain words, to anyone who would listen. Mothers, retired miners, college kids home for the summer. A few brought cameras, some brought notebooks. Everyone walked away seeing the creek differently. By the end of summer, Dale wasn't fighting alone. He had a quiet but growing army, and Brenda knew it. The dirt had been dug up. Soon. Dale was going to bury her ambition in it. The first time Dale saw his own face on the 6 o'clock news, he nearly dropped his tea. Someone maybe? Marla. Maybe one of the students who'd joined a creek walk had sent local TV the before and after shots of Cottonwood. Creek along with the words, "This is what our HOA did to history." What had started as a neighborhood feud now had a camera crew parked in Dale's gravel driveway, asking, "Can you describe how this has affected you personally?" While a boom mic hovered just out of view. At first Dale was hesitant. He wasn't a soundbite person. He'd spent his life in field notebooks and measuring instruments, not in front of cameras. But he realized quickly, the media wasn't a distraction. It was a loudspeaker. And like any good engineer, he knew the value of amplification. The legal. Fuse's lit asterisk, the federal injunction Dale had filed months earlier, finally got traction. Thanks. In part, to the pile of financial evidence Sheila had uncovered. A federal judge agreed to hear the case, with the Clean Water Act violations as the central argument. The missing HOA funds and possible racketeering weren't officially part of this suit, but they were cracking Brenda's credibility wide open. The day of the first hearing in Denver, Dale walked into the courthouse in his cleanest jeans to the quiet horror of his attorney, a young and ambitious environmental lawyer named Tony Rivas. Tony, in a crisp suit and polished shoes, whispered, "Dale, this is a federal building. You couldn't. Just once, try slacks." Dale smiled. "I'm here to talk about a creek, not audition for Wall Street." Tony sighed, but later admitted that the TV clip of Dale in jeans and boots, speaking calmly about water rights, made him look exactly like what he was. The authentic defender of a piece of Colorado history. Brenda's counterattack. Brenda arrived, draped in a deep red blazer, flanked by two high-priced attorneys, and delivered her statement to the waiting cameras with polished calm. "This case is about moving our community forward and keeping it safe. Some people fear progress, but as HOA president, my duty is to protect homes and lives." It might have sounded convincing, except that every major news affiliate had also read the expos about the missing Mayuan Arshawan. And one bold reporter shouted, "And where's the money, Ms. Hartwell?" Brenda ignored the question, walking away with a stiff jaw. Inside the courtroom, the hearings were tense. Tony pounded on the key points. Dale's water rights dated back to 1873 and were legally senior to HOA authority. No federal 404 permit had been issued for altering the creek. The so-called engineering assessment did not exist in any verifiable form. The concrete channel had already caused measurable downstream erosion and habitat loss. Dale testified with maps, old photographs, and the original hand-drawn diagrams from his grandfather's engineering report. He spoke slowly, answering every question without jargon, but with precision. When a defense attorney tried to suggest Dale was overly sentimental about the creek, he countered, "Sentimental is hanging a painting on your wall because it's pretty. This is protecting a living system, older than you, me, and this courthouse combined." Several members of the press scribbled that down verbatim. Public pressure mounts outside the courthouse. Environmental groups joined the fray. Students from Colorado State's Environmental Law Clinic showed up with hand-painted signs, "Save Cottonwood Creek, Science over Greed," and the simple, haunting, "Water has rights." Local businesses threw in support. The cafe started selling Free the Creek mugs, and a local print shop offered free banners to neighbors opposing the channel. Even a few ranchers, not known for loving government interference, stood with Dale, because if a newly formed HOA could bulldoze through water rights this old, anyone's historic claim was vulnerable. Cameras don't blink. The turning point came during the third day of testimony, when Tony presented time-lapse footage Dale had taken showing the creek's transformation from a meandering ribbon of life into a brittle concrete gutter. Projected onto a giant screen, The before and after images were devastating. You could hear people in the courtroom whisper, even gasp, when Brenda's lawyer tried to object. The judge, an outdoorsman known to fish the very rivers the case touched on, overruled him sharply. At that moment, Brenda turned and caught Dale's eye. For the first time, she didn't glare. She looked. Worried, the press tore into the story that night. David v. Goliath. Retired hydrologist battles HOA over 150-year-old creek writes concrete corruption in Colorado water. The battle for Cottonwood Creek. Dale became an unwilling local hero. He couldn't buy groceries without someone stopping to shake his hand or offer, "Hey, we're with you." Wasn't about him anymore. It was bigger. National outlets were calling. Environmental law professors were assigning the case too. Their students. Brenda, meanwhile, was being cornered from two sides: the courtroom and the district attorney's ongoing criminal investigation into HOA finances. The river of truth was rising. Concrete walls, no matter how expensive, couldn't hold it back. The courthouse in Denver was packed so tightly that morning you could smell the nervous sweat and old coffee. Every seat was taken, and a crowd spilled into the hallway, watching through the open double doors. Dale sat at the plaintiff's table, calm enough on the outside, but with a steady thrum in his chest. A few feet away, Brenda sat rigid, flanked by her two attorneys, her signature blazer a little less crisp, her lipstick a shade too bright, as if war paint might cover cracks. Judge Ellison, a man with the kind of lined face that spoke to decades of giving hard news, entered without ceremony. The murmurs died instantly. This was it. The ruling Judge Ellison's voice carried the steady weight of a mountain stream, slow but relentless. The court found that Brenda Hartwell and the HOA had knowingly altered a federally protected waterway. Without required permits under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, Dale Brennan's historic 1873. Water rights were legally senior and could not be infringed by HOA regulation. The concrete channel posed significant ecological risk and increased downstream flood hazard, as confirmed by expert testimony and historical records. Order. Immediate cessation of all work on Cottonwood Creek HOA to fund and oversee. Under independent supervision, the complete removal of the concrete channel, full ecological restoration. 2. Original meander, native vegetation reestablishment within 2 years. Civil penalties assessed to the HOA, with Brenda Hartwell personally named in transferring damages. And then came the unexpected kicker. Given evidence of mismanaged and likely misappropriated HOA funds, Judge Ellison formally referred the matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. Brenda's face didn't just fall, it cracked. Dale caught the quick, panicked glance she fired toward her lawyers. For just a second, she looked small. Silence before the storm. For almost 5 seconds, the room was silent. Then it began. Not a cheer exactly, but a rustling wave of relieved exhalations. Neighbors exchanged quick hugs. Someone actually whispered, "Holy hell, he did it." Tony, his young attorney, gave Dale a firm handshake, eyes bright. "That's a clean sweep. You know how rare that is? You fought this from the ground up and won everything?" Dale gave a small, almost private smile. "It wasn't just me. And it hadn't been. It was Marla with her photos. Sheila with her spreadsheets, the students with their signs, the cafe mugs and the rancher endorsements. One man against a flood can drown. But a community moves like a tide. The media frenzy by that afternoon. The ruling had broken across national wires. Federal judge orders HOA to tear out Concrete Creek Channel. Restore historic waterway. Environmental blogs called it the Cottonwood Creek precedent. Legal analysts discussed the strength of combining senior water rights with environmental law. Cable news even ran the phrase environmental. David versus HOA Goliath, complete with grainy footage of Dale in jeans and boots, explaining water flow to a field trip of kids. Brenda, she vanished from public view. Rumors swirled, her real estate license suspended, her passport flagged pending investigation. Her luxury SUV quietly traded for something more modest. The cleanup begins within 2 months. The heavy machinery was back, but this time under court-appointed ecological oversight. The concrete slabs, once laid like a coffin for the creek, were hauled away. The ground smelled of fresh soil again. Students and volunteers planted young willows and sedge grasses, their roots quick to take hold and weave into the banks. Trout fingerlings were reintroduced upstream. By spring, the creek was already beginning to remember its curves. And Dale, he didn't celebrate loudly, just kept showing up, measuring flow rates, keeping a quiet log. He knew restoration wasn't instant. The land was like an old wound. It would take time, patience, and care to fully heal, justice in every ripple when people thanked him. And they did. Stopping him on the road, sending handwritten notes, leaving pie on his doorstep, Dale would just nod and say, "Cottonwood Creek has been here long before us, and now it's going to be here long after." It wasn't about winning a case anymore. It was about what they left for whoever came next. The creek sang again, that low, chuckling sound over stones. To Dale, it was the sound of survival. 3 years after Judge Ellison's gavel fell, Cottonwood Creek looked as though nothing had ever happened. Well, almost nothing. If you looked closely, you could still find faint scars from the concrete. Short stretches where the soil was newer, where the willows weren't quite as tall as their older neighbors. But the water was wide and free again, curling against the banks in all its old familiar patterns. Minnows darted in the shallows, and dragonflies stitched bright lines across the summer air. It was healthy, alive, and in a way, so was the community. Town that changed its tune. The HOA didn't die, though many thought it would after Brenda's downfall. What changed was its focus. Under new leadership, a no-nonsense retired firefighter named June Miller. The HOA's meetings looked nothing like the tense, lawyer-peppered affairs of the past. Transparency was mandatory. Every expenditure was posted online. The once neglected community comment section at meetings now ran long, partly because people actually came. June even made a point at the very first meeting after being elected to say, "This HOA works for you, not the other way around. And nobody here owns the creek. We only borrow it for our lifetime." The applause had been long and loud, from local case to national example in the legal world. Brennan v. Cottonwood Estates HOA became shorthand for how to fight overreach. With a blend of historical property rights and environmental law professors dissected it in classrooms from Boulder to Boston. Week-long workshops for law students used mock trials based on Dale's case, teaching them how to blend science, law, and public outreach into a cohesive strategy. Colorado. Lawmakers, some of them admittedly skeptical of environmentalists, found themselves introducing a bipartisan bill nicknamed the Cottonwood Act. The law required HOAs statewide to undergo independent environmental reviews before altering any natural waterway. It passed with surprising ease after a steady drip of public support letters, editorial endorsements, and even testimony from small town mayors who'd watched their own waterways suffer under modernization projects. Dale the reluctant. Dale never liked the term hero. He said heroes were people who ran into burning buildings or jumped into rivers to save strangers. He just stayed stubborn about something worth protecting. Still, he couldn't escape it. Invitations rolled in. Keynote speaker at an environmental restoration summit in California TV. Interviews about how grassroots action can topple corruption. Even a friendly documentary crew that spent a summer filming the creek's recovery. He allowed most of them. But on one condition, the focus had to be on the creek, the law, and the community, not on the man who did it. More often than not, reporters left with as many quotes from Marla, June, Sheila, and the student activists as they did from him. From water rights to water. Wisdomdale started hosting an annual Creek Day every spring. It wasn't just for Cottonwood Estates. People drove in from nearby towns, sometimes whole school classes. Kids got their hands muddy planting sedges. Volunteers repaired trail sections along the banks. There were storytelling circles where old ranchers and tribal elders spoke about how their families had lived with never against the waterways. Dale's favorite part was always the sound. After a morning of digging, planting, and laughter, the kids would quiet just long enough to hear the water. In that moment, every year you could see them understand, even if they couldn't quite put it into words, why any of this mattered. Brenda's footnote has for Brenda Hartwell. She eventually resurfaced. Briefly, after serving a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperating in a wider HOA corruption probe, she moved out of state. The last anyone in Cottonwood heard, she was working quietly in a small property management office in Arizona. Her name became a cautionary tale here, not pure villainy, just a reminder that unchecked ambition mixed with a little arrogance can ruin more than it improves. Why it lasted, it wasn't just that Dale won a case. It was how he won. By outthinking instead of outshouting. By gathering allies instead of building walls. By proving that science, law, and community memory, when lined up, are stronger than greed. No matter how big the machines or glossy, the plans. Cottonwood Creek now ran not just through land, but through the town's identity. And sometimes, when Dale walked its bank in the late evening, he could hear echoes of all the voices that had stood with him. The creek still whispered, chuckled, and sighed the way it always had, but now its song carried the memory of a whole community that had refused to watch it be silenced. Epilogue. The Old Rock one afternoon. Dale sat again on the big flat rock his grandfather had once called the council seat. A group of kids splashed nearby, their laughter bouncing down the water. The sun was low, turning the world into shades of gold. He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the surface. 1 hop, 2, 3. Then he just sat there, content. Not because he'd won something for himself, but because that stone, those ripples, and that creek would still be here long after his time, telling their own story. Long after anyone remembered the court case that saved it.